Over to you, Graeme.
Okay, thanks, Anne. Okay, so I'm going to talk briefly about the history of aerial 1080 use, and it's sort of not a rigorous description of the history of aerial 1080 use. Rather, it's just a rough outline of important things that have happened. And the idea is we get us all up to speed because later on today and tomorrow, me and my docky colleagues are going to be talking about a whole lot of changes that have been made to the 1080 program over the last few years. And I sort of want to drag everybody up to speed before we start doing that. So anyway, launching into it, this picture has got nothing to do with my talk at all, but I rather like the picture of the turn. So now 1080 use in New Zealand, of course, started with possums. So you're going to get a brief history of possums. So the first possums came to New Zealand, released at Riverton in 1858. And then between 1890 and 1900 was kind of peak possums, with lots of possums being brought over to New Zealand from Australia. Between 1890 and 1940, they were deliberately spread around the country from the already established populations. And then in 1922, folk first noted the detrimental effect of possums on forest, dead trees, I suppose they spotted. And then in 1947, possums, which had been protected up until then, became unprotected and people could trap and shoot them at will. Of course, they had been being killed before then, I know, because my granddad used to kill them. And then in 1956 rather, we had the first go at killing them on a large scale. Now, of course, we didn't do it with a helicopter and a tractor like that, but I couldn't find a picture of a plane in a hurry. So anyway, we did our first 1080 operation in 1956. And of course, we were at that stage, we were protecting forest values because we didn't have anything else on our minds. In 1959, the first sort of evidence of the beech mast, rodent and stoat plagues phenomenon was brought to light during a Fiordland expedition, and of course Kim King developed that a lot in subsequent years.
You got correct here.
Oh, somebody's talking. In the 60s, it was discovered that possums were a reservoir of bovine TB, and that eradication of TB from our cattle would require elimination of TB from the wild possum population. And in the early 70s, we had the first go at killing possums using an aerial 1080 to prevent the spread of bovine TB. From the 70s to the 90s, aerially applied 1080 was used regularly to kill possums, and that was both to prevent the spread of bovine TB and for forest health. It was all about possums. In the late 80s, we figured out that there were forest birds that were still declining, and that some declines were being driven by plagues of rodents and mustelars that followed beech mast. And in about 1990, John's already talked about this, we had the first go at using 1080 to control possums and rats to benefit kōkako in the central North Island. This one was nothing to do with mast, it was just because there were high numbers of rats and possums that were damaging the kōkako populations. And then in 1994, we had the first go at using aerially applied 1080 to kill possums to prevent them preying on Paulophanta land snails in Kahurangi National Park and in Bulla. In 1999, Elaine Murphy figured out that stoats were killed in good numbers through secondary poisoning using 1080. They ate the dead and dying rodents and possums that had eaten the 1080 baits. I just realised I can't see my clock. That's devastating. In 2003, DOC started its Operation ARC program, which has subsequently undergone a whole lot of changes in name, but the programs remained much the same. And this was centred on protecting species like long-tailed bats, mohua, orange-fronted parakeets, and whio from the plagues of rodents and stoats that occurred after beech masts. And up until about 2005, our ability to deal with rodent plagues and beech masts was severely hampered by the fact that 1080 sometimes were quite good at killing rats, but often it failed, and we didn't know why. In 2006, we figured out that as long as you pre-fed the 1080 ops, you usually got a good rat kill. So from 2006 onwards, many of the 1080 operations undertaken by DOC were in beech forests and were focused on protecting forest birds from rat and stoat plagues. We could protect kakakia, whio and kiwis by killing stoats, and we could protect the smaller forest birds by controlling rats. And we could do it all with aerially applied 1080. So that started this sort of modern phase of 1080 use in DOC. And in about 2012, Dave Kelly and a bunch of his mates figured out that beech masts were relatively predictable using some climate clues. Adrian's already talked about delta T. So from then on, each year, we've made an annual prediction of the likelihood of beech mast all over the country. And this map shows you the sort of thing we produce annually. And we've been able to plan 1080 ops with as much as a year's warning of when they might be needed. This has been a real boon for us because getting a 1080 op together is a bit of an epic. And having a year's warning of when it might be needed is rather handy. Now, a lot of the 1080 operations that we've been undertaking in recent times have been sort of based around a model of the way that rat, mouse, and stoat populations respond to beech mast. And I'm just going to quickly run through that. So on this graph along the bottom, I've got time, and I'm picking the 2019 big beech mast to do it all in. So the beech trees flower and seed in the spring and summer. The seed falls in the autumn, and the seed lies around on the ground until it rots or germinates over the winter. In response to that, lots of seed, the rats and mice breed all winter, and their breeding continues apace until, can I have a pointing tool? Oh, yes, until about here, when the seed germinates and the population growth diminishes rapidly, but doesn't necessarily stop. It's still summer, things aren't too bad for a rat. But sometime in the following winter, they run out of food and there's a real crash. And people have already talked about that today. Whoops. Of course, stoats don't breed continuously like rats and mice do. They just have pulses of breeding. And we suppose that it might occur something like this during a beech mast year. They have a really good, really high productivity, produce lots of babies. But then in subsequent years, it gets smaller again. And it's during this period here, when we have high numbers of rats and stoats, that lots of the damage is done to our forest birds. Now, if you add possums into the mix, they don't respond in the same way as rats and stoats and rats and stoats, so they're fairly constant right through. Now, for small birds like moorhaw, we had the notion that we needed to protect them while they were breeding because they nest in holes in trees and only the females incubate. They're very vulnerable. And so it'd be a good idea to get rid of the rats and stoats just before the moorhaw started breeding. So for a long time, we've been doing 1080 operations in the spring, just before birds like moorhaw started breeding. And we suppose that this is what happens. We killed the rats just before the moorhaw started breeding. We also killed the stoats just before. And as kind of a bonus, we got rid of the rats. The possums, sorry. So during that moorhaw breeding season, things were really good for the birds and they might do really well. If you sort of look at it a bit more closely, it sort of looks something a bit more like this. We did the 1080 operation, we knocked the rats down, but for the couple of months after we knocked them down, they would recover because there's still plenty of seed around. But then they got to the point in about December when the seed germinated and the population growth stopped or at least slowed. And then sometime in the following winter, it crashed. And we had the notion that if there was a sort of damage threshold for something like a moorhaw, which is at about a 30% tracking rate, we'd keep it below that damage threshold for most of the time. Going for time. 9, and now I'm supposed to go 15. Oh, tons of time. Okay, so this is just a sort of summary of the amount of 1080 used over the last 10 years or so, and I put it in terms of hectares over which the poison sown. And the key protagonists of this are dock and osprey. And you can see that the osprey 1080 use is about, it's fairly constant compared with docks at a bit over 200,000 hectares per annum. But then dock's use goes up and down like a yo-yo in response to the mast phenomenon. So when there's mast on, we use lots of it, and in between times we don't do so much. So dock's use averages about 400,000 hectares per annum, but at times it goes up to 1 million hectares per annum. So that's what it's looked like for the last 10 years. The other thing I wanted to talk about briefly was the monitoring program that we've got that goes along beside the 1080 program. So I didn't know quite what to show you, so I've looked back to 2010 to tell you what we were doing then, and my colleagues will tell you about what we've been doing more recently later on today and tomorrow. So in 2010, we had about 11,000 tracking tunnels to monitor rats, mice, and stoats scattered around New Zealand, something like that. And they were run 4 times per annum, run for one night for rats and mice, and that's baited with peanut butter. And then once a year, they were baited with meat, rabbit meat, and they were run for 3 nights. And that gave us a really good picture of what was going on with rats and mice, and a worse picture of what was going on with stoat. But if you look at it in detail, what we had back in 2010, so I've zoomed in here on the Dart and Rootburn valleys at the head of Lake Wakatipu, and you can see that all the tracking tunnels that we had at that time were really lovely and accessible. They were all beside the road or the track on the flat valley floor, and nice and easy to get at, and we had lots of them. So they gave us a really good picture of what was going on, in this case, in the tall red beech forests on the valley floor. But they didn't tell us anything about what was going on at higher altitudes in the mountain beech and silver beech forests. So things have changed a bit. We've rehashed our tracking tunnel network entirely, which others will tell you about later on. The only other thing that other monitoring we've done is possum monitoring with traps for residual trap catch, or with wax tags mostly in dock. So we have just intermittent doing that. Doesn't happen that regularly, but all around the country there's a bit of it has gone on most years. As well as this monitoring of rodents and stoats and possums, we've also done a whole lot of work on birds. So a lot of that's consisted of sort of one-off studies of the effect of 1080. So over the last 10 or so years, we've completed studies on all of these beasts to look at what happens to them when we use 1080. And pretty much for all of them, perhaps except Kia, the story's unequivocally good. They all do better out of 1080 use than we get more birds made of it than are killed by it by a long shot. And as well as these one-off studies, we've got a bunch of sort of continuous monitoring of some of those species and other species. So like we've got a program of long-term monitoring of rock crens, moorhor, obviously orange fronted kakariki because they're so rare. But all of these species have long-term monitoring programs that we have been doing. Some have been going on for more than 10 years, and other ones have only started recently. And that sort of brings you up to date with where we got to probably 5 or 6 years ago, and the story changes about then, and you'll hear more about that later on tomorrow and today. So that's it for me.
Cool, awesome. Thank you, Graeme. That was very, very well timed. So we've got time for about a question before going on to Dean. And I was just curious, with you had your example on moorhor and the damage threshold, and I was kind of curious whether that was kind of a species-specific study that you ended up on the 30% rat tracking sort of as a guideline for the damage threshold, or how you ended up determining that, of like, oh, when it's about 30%, that's a bit.
It was a little bit better than that, though not much. And we had a rat plague in the Catlins that we were monitoring more closely through, and it got to about 30%. I think it got to 31% tracking, and the moorhor seemed to be okay. And then probably the next rat tracking level we had was 60%, and they weren't okay. So all we know is that our damage threshold is somewhere between 30 and about 60%. So we've just gone on the precautionary side and said it's about 30. But more recently, some work's been done with tracking and moorhor monitoring at Makarora, and they've come up with almost the same figure, it's the annual rat tracking average is 12%, but that's roughly equivalent to a peak rat tracking during a mass of about 30%. So we've got 2 lines of evidence, and for moorhor, it's sort of quite well supported, but not so good for other species.
Yeah, cool, awesome. Thank you for that.